It's Gareth's Whim box. It's Gareth's Whim box. Episode 4. Sorry about the banging, putting my guitar down, and it's hitting my chair that I explained about last time. Welcome to Gareth's Whimbox, episode 4. Slightly shorter version today. I'm going to create shorter podcasts for your edification. Maximum half an hour, hopefully. But certainly not an hour and 28 minutes as I did in my first episode. Sorry for the delay for this episode of Gareth's Whimbox. But things have happened. So, this episode has a very direct theme, a very specific theme, that is to say, a very particular theme. And I'm going to talk about that, and at the end I'm going to read some words from my notebook, and I'll talk about that at the end. But this is semi-scripted, so I start with a little scripted bit that I wrote, and then I'm going to read some excerpts from some books. So yeah, let's start. Enjoy. Just take a sip of tea. The theme of today is institutions as genres, genres as institutions. Both institutions and genres are constructions, as we know, systemic inventions with coherent conventions sustaining them, with which practitioners and participants are familiar, and of which they are expert exemplifiers. To describe institutions as genres is to claim that these are recognizable, self-contained and unique, that they have recognizable, self-contained and unique features, practices and modes of operation that constitute what might be called species of institutions. Genres of institutions, we might say, are, for example, political parties, educational establishments, businesses, etc. These are genres of institutions. Like literary genres, there are shared conventions across institutions. Genres, literary genres, for example, share plot, structure, and at their fullest, language practices. Institutions share hierarchies, discrete teams responsible for particular functions, and also communication strategies between these discrete teams and between these functional units. In literary genres, themes, characters, figurative repetitions, and other devices communicate across texts. Take, for example, the BBC as an institution. This is a media institution. It's a media genre of an institution. On the other hand, science fiction. Science fiction is a subset of a broader genre. Fiction, both as a type of literary practice, but also the ways in which it functions as part of a publishing industry, i.e., it exemplifies particular types of institutions of writing. Both the BBC and science fiction are constructs created out of particular unique historical conditions. But crucially, they do not represent culture, society, political systems, i.e. what we might be called natural ways of living or being or understanding, or natural epistemological concepts or epistemological modes of understanding the world. For example, both science fiction and the BBC are institutions that have solidified into the appearance of inevitability, abolishing, for the most part, the contingent conditions of their construction. That is to say, what the BBC is and does, on the one hand, and what science fiction is and does, on the other hand, are attempts at organisation of particular arrangements of experience and expectation that have become, with time, stand-ins for what we take to be representations or representatives of particular things or particular institutions or particular genres. To these genres or institutions, an audience will become trained to expect certain things from them and to abolish their own understanding that things could be radically otherwise. So we buy into these things culturally, but we literally buy into these things. The license fee for the BBC and the fees or prices to buy books are part of this quid pro quo arrangement that we have with institutions and genres. But such products are neither what we naturally, or what we in inverted commas might naturally expect, nor are they institutions of representations. They are, on the contrary, constitutions of a particular set of conditions that articulate, in every new iteration, a historical set of ideas or ways of being, ways of structuring feeling, ways of structures of style, structures of feeling that are necessarily the past. I'll repeat that. These institutions and genres are constituted, the constitution of particular sets of conditions that articulate, in every new interaction or iteration, a historical set of ideas or ways of being and structures of feeling, and what I'm calling structures of style in terms of fiction, but also structures of style in terms of the styles of institutions. And these things are necessarily the past. They represent the past. They don't represent the present. A way of thinking about this, if you think of anything that ossifies into practices, i.e. teaching practices are an evolutionary thing, but there is some sort of origin or pastness to it that we need to keep on thinking about. Importantly, these things aren't inevitable, but they're constructed, as I've said, and we are all part of the network of expectation that gives these things the illusion of consistency and naturalness. In other words, as I've said before, abolishing the very real historical conditions in which these things were created. In other words, abolishing the pastness of the institution, of the construction of institutions and genre. Now, why am I writing this, or why did I write that kind of bit? Well, today I'm going to be reading and reflecting on some excerpts from two books. There's this book called The Biggest Aspidistra in the World, which is written by Peter Black. Biggest Aspidistra in the World, a personal celebration of 50 years of the BBC by Peter Black, and an essay by Fredric Jameson called Progress versus Utopia, or Can We Imagine the Future? Now, I've highlighted sections I'm going to read from these books, and I'm going to read them and reflect on them, and that's pretty much going to be the episode. But bear in mind what we've just thinking about, and what I've just been saying about the notion of that institutions, the theme of this thing, which is the institutions as genres as institutions, and how they are constructed things that abolish the historical conditions in which they were created, to give the illusion of naturalness, and that we invest in these things by expectation and also by paying for them and continuing to expect certain things of them, even though those expectations are constructed. So this book by Peter Black is called The Biggest Aspidistra in the World. It's a wonderful, it was published in 1972 to mark the 50th anniversary of the BBC. Just from the blurb, in November 1972, the BBC celebrates its 50th birthday. This book, this book is a contribution to the event by a man who has been around slightly longer than BBC and followed its achievement as a youthful and then adult listener and as a professional critic. Peter Black was a critic, and it says Peter Black's selected recollections are personal, but ones he believes most readers will share. This is really important, actually, about this book. There's something really patrician and a type of ownership about Peter Black's prose in here that sort of, it's vaguely smug, actually, as and the conditions of the creation of the BBC actually they're created out of a privileged smugness and a sense of kind of totally unearned willpower and unearned, how would you describe it? Unearned sort of expectation that things will go right. And there's something very, very British about it. I'm going to go into that in a minute. So, but anyway, so I read this book, and Peter Black's recollections are interesting. They're kind of, it's a bit annoying, actually, the writing in some ways. But I'm going to read excerpts from this, and I'm going to reflect on some of the passages. So the first chapter is called "The House That Reith Built," for reasons that should be clear, but I'll come around to this. I'll just read the first paragraph. The first chapter is called "The House That Reith Built," and it's number 1, like spears against the sky. I am a few years older, Black writes, than broadcasting as an entertainment, having been born in the same year that H.J. Round of the Marconi Company demonstrated the gadget that made it all possible. This was his 3-electrode gas-filled valve embodying an oxide-coated filament which greatly improved the quality of broadcast speech. The book is fascinating, actually, on the history of radio transistors and crystal sets and stuff. I mean, having said my comments about the smugness of it, it's a very interesting book. Anyway, to continue, I can remember what leisure was like without radio, only as a child observer in a middle-class home. People went to theatre, the thriving music hall, the silent movies, and could get a good restaurant dinner for 5 or 6 shillings. There was a lot of horse-drawn traffic about. Our doctor, for example, wore a top hat and spade beard and drove in a 1-horse carriage. At home, people made their own entertainment. They read not very good books, knocked up shelves and put down linoleum, played the gramophone, darned and knitted, and amused each other in the ways imperishably described by Mr. Pooter in the Diary of a Nobody. There's a sort of, this is me now, there's a sort of ease of dismissing of the middle classes here, which I find very interesting. You might think that even with the price of a drink as low as it was, a bottle of scotch cost 12 shillings 6 pennies. Some of these evenings would have been heavy going, but they were not. I dare say I should laugh now if I had heard my aunt playing a medley of great war tunes called Remember Louvain, with terrific noises in the bass to evoke the sound of a battle, but I didn't then. It was thrilling. These evenings were not dull, they were only normal. Meanwhile, broadcasting waited to change all that. So in 1919, the Marconi Company managed to get a license to broadcast experimental transmissions of speech and music from Chelmsford. So the Marconi Company created this object that could transmit, and the post office was very, very worried about this for some reason, because they thought that people would be corrupted. So the post office, which had a lot of power back then, delayed the start of broadcasting using Marconi's sets and things like that. Anyway, so he outlines this. Peter Black outlines this. A little further on, he says, once the possibilities of radio had become imaginable, they could no longer be held back. It's a really interesting sentence. Once the possibilities of radio had become imaginable, they could no longer be held back. So Marconi created a machine that could broadcast radio, and that had the ability to broadcast radio across the airwaves and to be received by a set. And then people started fiddling around with it by recording stuff. There was a first radio play, which was Cyrano de Bergerac, written by someone called Rittel, or translated by someone called Rittel. And so people were experimenting with how you could sort of project these things across the air. So it's a very, very, as Walter Benjamin writes about radio, it was a very, very nascent medium, obviously, and people were trying to work out how to use it. This is all by chance, and the people that were working out how to use it just by chance happened to be around at the time. might have had connections, might have had friends. Once the possibilities of radio had become imaginable, they could no longer be made back. So the conditions were created whereby sets were created. People started messing around with them. That drew up the possibility of what could be possible in this medium, and then opened the door to other people experimenting in these things. And he says thereafter events began to move very fast. In the early summer, the GPO invited applications to run a national service. In July, the leading company to the electronic communications field agreed to the GPO's suggestion. The GPO, by the way, is the... what was GPO? I don't know what it is. Suggestion, General Post Office. So the General Post Office, as I said, was very involved in this. General Post Office suggestion that they should form a single British broadcasting company. And on the 14th of November 1922, the BBC took over the 2LO's transmissions, which was the Marconi stuff. Birmingham and Manchester stations opened the day after. Within 4 months, a broadly nationwide service was putting out 4 to 5 hours of broadcasting daily. So it happened really, really quickly. And this is where chance and things like that happen as well. This is the next paragraph. Before all this began, the BBC had its biggest stroke of good luck. On the morning of 13th of October 1922, the eye of John Reith, a determined and successful Scottish engineering manager of 33, looking for a job which would fulfil his premonition that the Lord kept a sharp eye on his future, rested on an advertisement from the Morning Post. It was by the BBC. He invited applications for the jobs of general manager, director of programmes, and chief engineer to William Noble, chairman of the committee of founding members of the company. Reith wrote out his application for the general managership in the Cavendish Club. Then, having looked up Noble in Who's Who, he retrieved his letter from the hall porter and added a postscript. No doubt he will know some of my people in Aberdeen. This appeal to tribal loyalty, Noble was himself an Aberdonian, was a curious departure from Reith's austere code of self-reliance, but he had no doubt that this postscript, coupled with the hand of God, had done the trick. And his first meeting with the board of the BBC, his first acquaintance with the possibility of broadcasting, convinced him that he had found the work which the Lord had in mind for him. So, John Reith, who became the sort of general director, first director of the BBC, applied to this job on spec. Didn't really know, had some engineering experience, some managerial experience, and then wrote a postscript from his exclusive club and said, oh, by the way, you'll probably know some of the people I know in Aberdeen, and then got the job. So Marconi had created this radio transistor, and then the General Post Office said, we need to consolidate these powers and sort of bring them all together. Then this bloke, John Reith, was in his Cavendish Club and saw the thing, and then got a porter to send off the letter for him and got the job. Those are the historical conditions which created the BBC. The description, Peter Black's description of John Reith is I think it's ironic and sardonic, but it's sort of self-congratulatory as well. I'm not dismissing this as such. I just find it very, very interesting that this is how this vast institution, which is now consolidated into something which sort of is huge and almost beyond measure, started in this very, very lackluster and kind of fairly casual way, really, without people really knowing what they're doing. In fact, the descriptions later, it says this. At this stage, so at the beginning of the creation of the BBC, Reith's influence was chiefly political and economic, bent towards organising the facilities and chasing revenue. He laid down the programme policy, ordered the percentages of music, religion, variety, etc., but took little interest in the material except when it infringed on his moral code. One day he entered Lewis's office and threw down a copy of the Times on his desk. "I see Daisy Kennedy is performing tonight." Lewis was working 6 weeks ahead and had forgotten. "Oh, is she?" "Yes. Anything wrong with that?" "Have you seen the papers? She was divorced yesterday. We can't have a divorced woman performing." And this next paragraph is very interesting. "They were all totally untrained for the work they were doing," Lewis recalled half a century afterwards, but saw that the thing about broadcasting was that everything under the sun, not just entertainment, could be brought to it. Everyone was interested in it. One day Shaw turned up. Somebody spotted him in the waiting room playing among a group of children. Lewis grabbed him and promptly invited him to produce one of his plays, to read one of his plays, to talk, to do anything he liked. Shaw worked out that at a royalty of 5 shillings per listener, his fee ought to be about £10,000. But when Lewis said the most they could afford was £100, Shaw said he would read O'Flaherty, VC, for nothing. The broadcast was arranged. Shaw did it perfectly, and afterwards Lewis went to the pictures with him, feeling, he said, exactly like some Tudor spark must have done walking with Shakespeare. So, again, this all came about very, very lacklusterly. People approach people saying, "Can you do that? No, can you do it for free? The fees will probably make up for it. Oh, I'll do this one for free." It's very, very lackluster and very, very. It just happened. They started sort of messing around with things. This is the origins of the BBC. One of the things what the BBC did try to do was create sets that people would make, and they were going to make money through that. But eventually, they realised that actually what they were going to do was just set a price, set a fee, and this was this was the economic model. Another paragraph here. On the whole, the public shared the belief that there was something special about radio, until they got used to it. I think this was because it was mysterious as well as extraordinarily cheap and simple to make. I, says Peter Black, built several crystal sets, all of which worked quite well without my having the slightest idea how or what I was doing. That's so interesting, isn't it? I built several crystal sets, all of which worked quite well without my having the slightest idea how or what I was doing. This is the early days of radio. This is people cobbling together stuff to create something. Now, as I said, obviously, what we see in the BBC is we don't even see the evolution. We see it as existing as it is, almost inevitably. And those that work in it, see it in that way as well. And it becomes this ossified institution it's seemingly sort of almost impenetrable, and has all of its sort of hierarchies and things around it. But its origins were shonky, were full of these blokes that didn't know what they were doing, with extraordinary levels of power and privilege, just sort of chucking stuff together and then just cobbling it and making stuff happen. And Reith was sort of going around sort of gathering up money, feeding on his contacts, and sort of saying, "Yeah, I think we'll do it this way. I think we'll do it this way." And even relying, just seeing someone down the club, and then sort of saying, oh, "Would you mind reading something?" "No, I won't read that, but I'll read this." "Okay, go on then." And it was a highly fragile thing. The BBC, this is Black again, the BBC was financed in part by half the licence fee of 10 shillings and in part royalties on receivers sold. But again, as I said, they stopped selling receivers. They weren't really making that money because there was competition. And so then the licence fee came into effect. And last thing is just there's a paragraph which says the end of the beginning. The next chapter is sort of called The End of the Beginning. Insofar as it had no public money behind it, broadcasting was entirely dependent on the public's response to its programmes, but it was quickly obvious that progress was unstoppable. If the BBC had put out nothing but weather forecasts and hymn tunes, the rise in listening would probably have only been slightly affected, such was the strength of public interest. It was clear, too, that the licence fee system was going to be enough to pay for wireless without the help of the cumbersome and difficult royalty system. and the license system was the best possible one for enabling a service to develop without having to watch the box office returns. What the listener paid 10 shillings for was the right to operate a wireless receiver. Within that right, one listener's claim to be entertained was as good as, but no better than, another's. Wireless was, said Lewis, the most democratic entertainment ever devised. So loads of people couldn't get enough of it. They just bought their receivers and wanted to hear anything, and they did. So, and then he goes into lots of different interesting programs that were created in the early days. This last paragraph from this second chapter is really interesting, just factually, but also in terms of what I've been saying at the beginning. This is Black. From 1928, the BBC was producing 6,000 hours of programming a year for audiences never below 1 million, and often as high as 15 million. Its programme policy was summed up in a sentence from its review of that year. This is an amazing sentence. It would be a derogation of duty for those placed centrally in a position to know what of cultural interest is available, not to give the great public the opportunity of knowing for itself, without waiting for anything in the nature of indication that it was wanted. Or, as Reith's succinct working rule put it, offer the public something better than it now thinks it likes. A section on music illuminates the confident expectations of the early broadcasters. What seems to be encapsulated in these comments by both Black and, well, by the BBC's review and Reith's sentence, which again I'll read, offer the public something better than it now thinks it likes, is two things. Either this is a very, very democratic vision of humanity, which is saying that, and a hopeful vision of humanity, like that they don't know what they want, that they desire something better, let's say, or it's a really, really a singular, very, very narrow conception of the of democratic development of a genre and democratic development of an institution. This isn't a democratic development of an institution. The only way it makes it democratic is the fact that people have the right to buy into it, but the people actually didn't have any creative input in order to dictate what they wanted to listen to at this time. So, in other words, Reith and the reviewers and the very, very small number of blokes, they had a very, very particular conception of what the public was as a concept, which is to say they will have anything we want them to. They will have anything that we give them, and they'll pay for it, and they'll pay for the privilege, and we'll then sort of keep on giving them better than they expect. Now, this better than they expect, better than it now thinks it likes, offer the public something better than it now thinks it likes. So, is that a hopeful vision? Or is that a really patronizing vision of people? There's something very, very arch and single-minded about the conception or the conceptual figure of people there, and so these people had a very, very strong network of power or nexus of power, and then created and had all these conditions come together to enable them to put out this stuff. But their conception of people is almost negligent and negligible. And I'm not criticizing this, I'm thinking about it. So this is how the BBC was created. These are the original conditions. So to go back to what I was saying at the start, this institution is a construction. And what we now can, how far, for example, does this past conception of notion of people, British people, the public, that were basically created on the back of a fad packet by Reith and by others in the handbooks, how far does that concept, this is the key idea, does that concept of people, the concept of how the institution is going to work, how far does that come up to the present day? And or how far is that just a past conception of personhood, of British personhood? And I would suggest that unless you think about the sort of shambles of the creation of the BBC in many ways, and the very, very few people that actually created it, and what their conception of people were, and the British, and what people wanted, which is actually fairly low bar, that it's only through examining that really we can sort of think, oh, how far does that sort of come up to the present day? And if it does come up to the present day, that conception, that concept, that institutionalized version of what we might call a person or the British public, if it's still part of the institution, then of course it's reflecting the past. It's not reflecting the present. But the institution is so large and so immovable in many ways, and it's sort of intractable. All you can do is really tinker around the edges with it. So that you can see how the shambles of the construction of the BBC, or at least the let's say the historical conditions of the construction of the BBC, might have some effect on the way in which the institution is today. And I'm not saying that's a good thing or a bad thing. I'm just saying that it's interesting to think about this. So the next book I'll talk about is Fredric Jameson. Well, the next piece is Fredric Jameson's Progress versus Utopia, or Can We Imagine the Future? So this was first printed in Science Fiction Studies 9, number 2, July 1982, pages 147 to 158. And it's excerpted in a book that I have called Art After Modernism, Rethinking Representation, which is edited with an introduction by Brian Wallace and published by the Museum of Contemporary Art, New York, in 1984. So just to go back to the essay, this is an essay, Progress versus Utopia, or Can We Imagine the Future, by Fredric Jameson, originally from Science Fiction Studies, number 9, Science Fiction Studies 9, number 2, July 1982, pages 147 to 158. Now, this is a really, really interesting essay, as Fredric Jameson's work is. One of the interesting things about it, just initially, from my perspective, is that it starts with the Walter Benjamin quotation, "A storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in its wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. The storm is what we call progress." Now, in in episode 2, I talked about Walter Benjamin's thesis and how important it was to Walter Benjamin, and how actually he's referring to Paul Clay's Angel. What Jameson is talking about here is science fiction as a genre, and unless, exactly as I said at the beginning, what Jameson is proposing here is that unless we think about the creation of the genre of science fiction as something that came out of very specific material historical conditions, then we imagine that it's something more than it is. And in other words, the creation of science fiction and science fiction as it is articulated now, just like the BBC as it is institutionally articulated or institutionally expressed now, it expresses pastness, and it rather than being representative of the present. Now I'm going to go into this. This is a fascinating insight from it's Jameson's insight, not mine. I'll just read the first paragraph to this, because Jameson's a great writer. He says, "What if the idea of progress were not an idea at all, but rather the symptom of something else? What if the idea of progress were not an idea at all, but rather the symptom of something else?" That is to say, the concept of progress, or the idea of progress? What if it's not an idea actually, but it's a symptom of something else? So in other words, we've got to look at the abstract ideas and concepts are not intelligible entities in their own right. They are created out of a network of previous things. The notion of progress, in inverted commas, might seem inevitable. People might say, oh, it's common sense that we progress. This is obviously a Marxist argument in the sense of capitalism as progress. But, and it's a Marxist argument in terms of thinking at historical conditions of the creation of ideas. What if the idea of progress were not an idea at all, but rather a symptom of something else? I'll carry on. This is a perspective suggested not merely by the interrogation of cultural texts, Jameson writes, such as science fiction, but by the contemporary discovery of the symbolic in general. Indeed, he's drawing on Lacanian ideas here. Indeed, following the emergence of psychoanalysis, of structuralism in linguistics and anthropology, of semiotics together with the new field of narratology, of communications theory, new field, this is 1982, and even such events as the emergence of politics of surplus consciousness in the 1960s, we have come to feel that abstract ideas and concepts are not necessarily intelligible entities in their own right. This was, of course, already the thrust of Marx's discovery of the dynamics of ideology, but while the old terms in which that discovery was traditionally formulated, false consciousness versus science, remain generally true, the Marxian approach to ideology, itself fed by all the discoveries enumerated above, has also become a far more sophisticated and non-reductive form of analysis than the classical opposition tends to suggest. Now, these are big ideas. These are confusing ideas in lots of ways. But I think, to boil it down, I think what as I said, what Jameson is saying here is that ideology, as Marx said, the dynamics of ideology are that then ideology isn't something which exists independent of the ideology itself is not an abstract idea, and if it becomes an abstract idea independent of material conditions or historical reality, then that's when it becomes problematic. And so this idea that, and what he's saying, and what Jameson is saying is, like the idea of progress. If we think of it as he says, an intelligible entity in its own right, if we think of ideology as an intelligible entity in its own right, it has no foundation, it has no basis, it has no past, it has no creation. And so this is his main argument, and he's thinking about science fiction, the science fiction genre, like this, and I've extended that out to think about the BBC. I'm just going to continue reading some of Jameson's text here. He says about this discovery of the symbolic. Again, he's talking about Lacan, and also how psychoanalysis and structuralism have overlapped here. The discovery of the symbolic, however, he writes, suggests that for the individual subject, as well as for groups, collectivities, and social classes, abstract opinion is but a symptom or an index of some vaster pensée sauvage about history itself. So some more base thinking or material thinking about history itself, whether personal or collective. So abstract opinion is a symptom or index of some vaster thinking, vaster baseline or inner thinking about history itself, whether that's personal or collective. This is what he describes elsewhere, this vaster thing that creates, which is the intelligible context for abstract thinking. Jameson elsewhere in The Political Unconscious calls the political unconscious, which is his book from 1981. So what he then says is the task of such analysis, i.e. thinking about the political unconsciousness, and this is from the essay here, such analysis would then be to detect and to reveal behind such written traces of the political unconscious as the narrative text of high or mass culture. So in other words, what he's saying is, how are these narrative texts, he talks earlier about modernism, and he's going to go on to talk about science fiction. Like, how are texts? What are the background? What's the background unconscious, political unconscious, the trace that we can see behind these texts? He also says, but also behind those other symptoms or traces which are opinion, ideology, and even philosophical systems. The outlines of some deeper, vaster narrative movement in which the groups of a given collectivity at a certain historical conjuncture anxiously interrogate their fate and explore it with hope or dread. So he's talking about, like, what are the broader codes that we need to tap into. Now, he then turns briefly to look at science fiction, and he looks at H.G. Wells and the precursors, Jules Verne, the precursors of sort of modern science fiction. And his way of thinking about science fiction as a genre and its creation is encapsulated in some key moments that I'm going to read now. So he says this: I will suggest that the model for this kind of analysis, i.e. thinking about the historical context or material conditions in which science fiction was created, which grasps an entire genre as a symptom and reflex of historical change. So the model of this kind of analysis, which grasps an entire genre as a symptom reflex of historical change, may be found in Georges Leclerc's study, The Historical Novel. So Georges Leclerc's 1936 historical novel. This is his idea that JC's premising. Leclerc began with an observation that should not have been particularly surprising. It was no accident, he said, that the period which knew the emergence of historical thinking, of historicism in its peculiarly modern sense, the late 18th and early 19th century, should have witnessed in the work of Sir Walter Scott the emergence of a narrative form peculiarly restructured to express that new consciousness. And this is Lukács' idea, and that Brecht sort of took massive exception to, as did Adorno, as did Benjamin. But the idea is that these particular genres, the historical novel, emerged as a consequence to capture a new consciousness. Jameson says this: just as modern historical consciousness was preceded by other, for us now, archaic forms of historiography, the chronicle, for example, or the annals, so the historical novel in its modern sense was certainly preceded by literary works which evoked the past and recreated historical settings, like, for example, Shakespeare's history plays or Arthurian romances and things like that. But this is the key, one of the key passages here. Jameson says this: yet all these works and their visions, their various ways, affirm the past as being essentially the same as the present. I.e., in other words, they tap into some sort of universalized conception of humanity or something. And to follow Jameson, do not yet confront the great discovery of modern historical sensibility, that the past, the various pasts, are culturally original and radically distinct from our own experience of the object world of the present. Radically distinct from our own experience of the object world of the present. The discovery may now seem to be seen as part of what may, in the largest sense, be called bourgeois cultural revolution, the process whereby the definitive establishment of a properly capitalist mode of production, as it were, reprograms and utterly restructures the values, life rhythms, cultural habits, and temporal sense of its subject. I'll repeat this. The discovery may now be seen as part of what may in the largest sense be called the bourgeois cultural revolution. In other words, the process whereby the definitive establishment of a properly capitalist mode of production, as it were, reprograms and utterly restructures the values, life rhythms, cultural habits, and temporal sense of its subjects. He continues, capitalism demands in this sense a different experience of temporality from that which was appropriate to a feudal or tribal system, to the polis, or to the forbidden city of the sacred despot. It demands a memory of qualitative social change, a concrete vision of the past which we may expect to find completed by that far more abstract and empty conception of some future terminus, which we sometimes call progress. This is really, I mean, this is quite, to me anyway, very, very profound and kind of vaguely disturbing thinking, in the sense of what Jameson and others argue is that what happened is that a bourgeois cultural revolution happened where capitalist modes of interaction and understandings of time, pastness, of the way in which we've evolved from certain states of being into a kind of natural states of being now, in inverted commas, reprograms its subjects into believing that there wasn't anything prior to that, or that we were always already kind of moving towards this notion of progress, always already moving towards this sense of the present. So to go back to what I was saying at the beginning, if we think about institutions and genres as inevitable, or as representative of human consciousness, what we're actually talking about, or representative of human present, what we're actually talking about is genres and institutions as representations of institutions and genres that have become the de facto default ways of operating, which was something that was constructed in order to sort of perpetuate itself, in order to, and we then share a collective memory of how things develop, as if they developed sort of almost naturally. And what that doesn't take into account is that actually this was a constructed origin moment, as it were. Yeah. And so he goes on to talk about science fiction. He says this: the common sense position on the anticipatory nature of science fiction, i.e. science fiction sort of anticipates futures, as a genre, is what we today call a representational one. So this goes back to what I was talking about, representation. These narratives are evidently, for the most part, not modernizing, not reflective, and self-undermining, deconstructing affairs. They go about their business with the full baggage and paraphernalia of conventional realism, but with this one difference: that the presence, that the full presence, the settings and actions to be rendered are merely possible and conceivable ones of a near or far future. So we sort of think, oh yeah, science fiction is the representing the future, or as visions of the future. This is a really interesting paragraph. If I can accept this account of science fiction, it is at least in part because it seems to me that for all kinds of reasons we no longer entertain such visions of wonder-working, properly science fiction futures of technological automation. These visions are themselves now historical and dated, streamlined cities of the future on peeling murals, while our lived experience of our greatest metropolises is one of urban decay and blight. That particular utopian future, the sort of early days of projecting into the shiny future, that particular utopian future has, in other words, turned out to have been merely the future of one moment of what is now our past. Think about early Star Trek. That is a particular utopian future, is the future of one moment, like 1950s, 1960s, of what is now our own past. So the 1960s projected into the future from the past. But what's interesting about that is Star Trek, for example, which I'm a huge fan of. If you watch Star Trek now, it still has this projected into the future utopic version of humanity that was actually constructed in the 1950s, 1960s through the science fiction genre. They tinker around the edges, but it's still a perfect working system where, poverty has been abolished, everyone, has the right to do X, Y, and Z, but they don't. Wesley Crusher has to go through a big song and dance to get into the academy, and many people don't. It's still a hierarchical society. It's still in Star Trek Next Generation. It's still a society in which Deanna Troi, is wearing kind of a sort of cleavage dress. That is to say, it has a 1980s, 1990s vision of women. She changed that later on. But anyway, my point is that it's as it says, the future of one moment of what is now our own past. How does this relate to genre? Fredric Jameson says this: we have seen that in the moment of the emergence of capitalism, the present could be intensified and prepared for individual perception by the construction of a historical past from which, as a process, it could be felt to issue slowly forth like the growth of an organism. We could have seen, I'll read that again. We have seen that in the moment of the emergence of capitalism, the present could be intensified and prepared for individual perception by the construction of a historical past from which, as a process, it could be felt to issue slowly forth like the growth of an organism. In other words, the reorganization of our understanding of subjecthood and temporality by a capitalist structure reprograms, as he says before, and reformulates our conception of the development of our sensibility into in a straight line of progress. Star Trek articulates that it's sort of humanity's going in one way. It sort of does say about, in Star Trek Next Generation, the first episode, Farpoint Station, where Q is accusing humanity of being corrupt and horrific, and they allude to sort of the mid 21st century apocalyptic war, and then 22nd century armies and army people on drugs and stuff like that. And he says, but we got over that. In other words, humanity progressed to this level. Now, how does this relate to genre? I'll just finish with all the creation of science fiction. Jameson says this: science fiction enacts and enables a structurally unique method for apprehending the present as history. And this is so irrespective of the pessimism or optimism of the imaginary future world, which is the pretext for that defamiliarization. What Jameson suggests is that science fiction gives us a really interesting access into the ways in which past minds have created visions of the future, which essentially reveal a lot of the historical conditions of the emergence of particular sets of minds. So we need to look behind the creation of genres. I'll just read this last paragraph. We must therefore now return to the relationship of science fiction and future history and reverse the stereotypical description of this genre. What is indeed authentic about as a mode of narrative and form of knowledge, science fiction, as a mode of narrative and a form of knowledge, is not at all its capacity to keep the future alive, even in imagination. On the contrary, its deepest vocation is over and over again to demonstrate and to dramatize our incapacity to imagine the future, to body forth through apparently full representations, which prove on closer inspection to be structurally and constitutively impoverished. The atrophy of our time of what Marcuse has called utopian imagination. The imagination of otherness and radical difference, to succeed by failure and to serve as an unwitting and even unwilling vehicles for a mediation which, setting forth from the unknown, for the unknown, finds itself irrevocably mired to the all-familiar, and thereby becomes unexpectedly transformed into a contemplation of our own absolute limits. In other words, it's difficult to summarize that. But what Jameson is claiming here is that that science fiction is good as an illustration of how constrained our imaginations are by, let's just say, the conventions of thinking that are ossified and sedimented within particular genres. Serve as he says, structurally and constitutively impoverished, and so it's sort of if we read science fiction to expect certain things of science fiction, essentially what we're getting is a repetition of the same limitations on our imagination about what a future can be, or in other words, the desire to be able to have a vision, but based in the conventions of the science fiction genre, or conventional patterns of imagining, let's say, is just to contemplate the absolute limits of our imagination. So unless we try and sort of think about the origins of science fiction, think about why certain tropes, why certain let's just say very, very broadly, conceptions of personhood, as I said about the BBC, unless we think about the way in which these things can be rethought, or at least they are first, and the first part of that is to think they are a product of the past, then we're never going to get forward. We're always going to be replicating the same conditions, same historical material conditions that set up the origins of both institution and genre. As he says, our constitutional inability to imagine utopia itself. And we are kind of what Jameson is arguing is we can be prisoners to this sort of ideological closure of institutions and genres. And so I suppose that's what I was saying is the relationship. My theme today is institutions as genres, genres as institutions, and how we need to. I think that if one wants to, you can sort of think about institutions and genres as, you know, based in very, very particular historical circumstances and material conditions. So the material conditions of the BBC that I outlined is these educated, elite, privileged white men creating this thing, and that sounds very woke, but it's true. They essentially brought their mates in and created this thing, and their concept, at the very basic, their conception of personhood was a pre Second World War conception of post First World War conception of what middle class people might want. And that version of what Britain is, or Britishness was incredibly powerful. And science fiction, I gave the example of science fiction TV, Star Trek. The conception of personhood that they have in there is a thoroughly capitalist one, or at least is a thoroughly confected one. Which is designed to offer the present circumstances as a useful origin for a future utopia, without really examining whether its foundational assumptions are valuable. Okay, so I've got, just to end, I've got two words. I've kept notebooks for 20 plus years, 25 years probably, no, more than that, 30 years. And all of my notebooks have got, I always, whenever I discover a new word, I look at the back. I write it down in the back. So all of my notebooks have at the back at least 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 pages of words, written in capital letters and then with definitions. And in my present notebook, GSF number 14, there's 2 words at the back, and I looked at those today, and they are relevant to our discussions for today. So the first word is contumacious. Contumacious. So just cracking open my Oxford English Dictionary, contumacious. Contumacious. Exhibiting contumacy. So contumacy, perverse and obstinate resistance to authority. So contumacious, exhibiting contumacy, stubbornly perverse, insubordinate, rebellious, from 1603. Willfully disobedient to the summons or order of a court, 1600. And this example, to reduce the contumacy of monks, contumaciousness of monks to obedience. So reluctance to yield to authority. Why is this relevant? Well, let's say we're contumacious. We're contumaciously engaged with institutions and genres here. Contumaciously engaged. We have a contumacious relationship with the notion of genre and institutions. That is to say, we're unwilling to yield to the fact that this is how they always are. Because what we've been thinking about today is thinking about why. Why is that? Where does that come from? The other word, so that's contumacious. Contumacious. The last word is exogenous. I'm sure you already know these words, but I didn't know what it meant, so I wrote it down. Exogenous. Growing by additions on the outside of the nature of an exogen, pertaining to or characteristic of exogens. In anatomy of a portion of bone growing out from a previously ossified part. Having external, another sort of related definition is having an external causal origin, originating from outside an organism, or attributable to an agent or an organism outside the body. So, for example, exogenous depression. My depression is caused by something outside of myself, not physiological. And that's interesting as well. Growing by additions, particularly this third definition, growing out of previously ossified parts. So we've talked today about how institutions and genres contain within them ossified concepts that become unexamined. And so in a sense, they are working, let's say, exogenously on us to or we are sort of the outgrowths of they're working exogenously on us to or they work exogenously. So there, and another way of thinking about it as well is there are external conditions creating these things that have become ossified. And so essentially we could be thinking, let's say exogenously or conceptually exogenously about the possibility of other outgrowths from let's say the creation of the BBC. The BBC could have created something, science fiction could have been something totally different. But we can't, can we imagine that? And it's up to us, I suppose, to try and maybe imagine those historical conditions in which these things were created, and then sort of think, it could have been different. The BBC could have been different. I suppose podcasting, me doing this, this could have been what broadcasting was. You know, I'm sure many people are happy that that's not the case, but nevertheless, it could have been. And there are loads of other ways of doing things. So that's it. Today's theory, concept was institutions as genres, genres as institutions. I'm not entirely sure how much sense I've made, but I found it interesting. And I hope some parts of this were too. It's Gareth's Whim Box, it's Gareth.